Well, I've got 3 p.m. Eastern Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Aaron Wybe, the Communication and Engagement Manager for the E-Extension Foundation. Just wanted to welcome you today. I'll be the technical host of this webinar, and I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Beverly Coberly, Chief Operating Officer with the E-Extension Foundation.
Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everyone, and we certainly welcome you this afternoon to what is a trauma-informed practice. It's the second webinar in our online series on investing in community resilience, deploying traumatic-informed practice for funders and capacity builders. So thank you so much for joining us. As he said, my name is Beverly Coberly, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer with the E-Extension Foundation. The E-Extension Foundation is very interested in this series. One of the things that the E-Extension Foundation is, we're a membership organization, and what's the opportunity to partner with the Scattergood Foundation, and from that partnership has come this series to talk about trauma-informed practices. We believe that this is a very important set of information to share across the country at this time with not only our members but other partners that are part of this group from the Scattergood Foundation and all of their colleagues, particularly in this type of the COVID-19 environment. It's good to learn more about how to deal with one another and trauma as we move forward. Basically, is we're going to start with the welcome and introductions, which is what I'm doing. Shortly, we'll talk about the learning objectives, and we'll have presentations from Megan Corrado, and she's going to talk about what is trauma-informed practice. Megan is with the Stories Guide in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Marsha Morgan will talk with us about what does trauma-informed practice look like in practice, and she's with the Resilience Builders in Kansas City, Missouri. So again, thank you for being here. We welcome you to the set of the series. This time I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Caitlin O'Brien, who's with the Scattergood Foundation, and she's a great partner. So Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. So sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties right as this was starting, but I'm so happy to be here with everybody today. And just if I can get a thumbs up from Aaron or Bev that you can see my screen. Okay, great, fantastic. Nothing like a little last minute technical difficulties to get you going. So as Bev said, I am Caitlin O'Brien. I am the Director of Learning and Community Impact at the Scattergood Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it focuses on improving outcomes in behavioral health. I'm so happy to be here today for our second session in the Investing in Community Resilience webinar series. In our last session, we had Dr. Danielle Prince from ACEs Connection present a background on the science of adverse childhood experiences, trauma, toxic stress, healing, and resilience. And today we're focusing on trauma-informed practice and methods for implementation in your organizations and communities. By the end of the webinar, we hope you'll be able to describe why trauma-informed practice is important, is a critical element for effectiveness, identify core elements of trauma-informed practice, and plan strategies for applying a trauma-informed lens. Before we start, I'd really like to thank our Investing in Community Resilience web series design team, who have helped shape and structure the content of the series. We really couldn't do it without them. And for today's webinar, I'd like to thank Claire Reedy of the Health Federation of Philadelphia and Melissa Sines from Peak Grantmaking, both of whom took extra time and attention to particularly plan this webinar today. So I also just want to say, I know we're hosting this session during a truly unprecedented time, and it's certainly one of heightened stress and for all of us. And in many ways, we are experiencing a collective trauma. And that really elevates for me why trauma-informed practice is even more important than ever before. So we really hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy. And please, if at any point you feel like you need to step away, please prioritize yourself and your well-being. We'll be posting and sending out a recording of the session, as well as the slides and materials, so you can revisit the material whenever you like. And with that, I'd actually like to start with a little bit of a breathing exercise. So I'm going to have everybody, if you can, just kind of place your feet firmly on the ground, and I'm going to go ahead and just play this video and just follow the prompt. So thanks so much. I really hope that was really just that kind of helped to calm your central nervous system and bring you into this space a bit and just provide some centering. So before we get to our presentation, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. We have two presenters today, as Bev mentioned earlier, and they'll be providing some, excellent material for you all. And we just ask that we're going to do question and answer at the end of each presentation, but that we have a lot of material to get through in a short time. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will make sure to do a short Q&A after Megan's presentation and then again after Marsha's presentation. So with that, it really is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Megan Corrado. Megan is a doctor of social work and a licensed clinical social worker. She is the creator of Stories Trauma Narrative Intervention and has authored 9 books. She is a full-time faculty member at Bryn Mawr College's Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research, and provides therapy to youth in Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. She has experience in a variety of settings and has incorporated creativity into her work. She earned a DSW from the University of Pennsylvania and a Master's of Social Services from Bryn Mawr College in 2009. Megan also serves as a board member on the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, a national organization which advocates for the adoption of trauma-informed care in public policy at the local, state, and federal levels. So with that, I am going to allow Megan to share her screen and pass it over to Megan.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. I am sharing my screen. I will turn on my video in a moment. So thank you everyone for being a part of today's webinar. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the truth about trauma-informed care. So I'm going to start off with some introductory information, and then I'm going to share some different principles, concepts with you as you seek to implement and understand trauma-informed care in a very real and connected way. All right, so to start off, how do we define trauma? Depending on the particular theorist that we're reading, the book that we're reading, the presenter that we're listening to, there are many different definitions for trauma. Here's one definition in the literature, and I quoted myself. But as many of you know, there are many different variations for definitions of trauma. So my definition of trauma is that it's an experience that causes a person to feel afraid, overwhelmed, out of control, and broken. Trauma affects how people view themselves, other people, and also the world around them. So how does trauma impact people? We're going to briefly explore some key ways that trauma impacts people, and we're also going to talk about how frequently people are exposed to trauma. So these are just 3 studies, and I wish that I could tell you that as you look at prevalence rates for different types of trauma that people may have experienced, I wish I could tell you that the numbers are more hopeful. Unfortunately, many communities have been exposed to trauma at really alarming rates. So we're going to briefly take a look at these 3. So there was a study of almost 1,700 urban children and teenagers, and these children and teenagers were between the ages of 7 and 21. The study showed that half of them had experienced violence, have had a family member that had experienced violence, and have had experienced an unexpected death of someone they were close to. There was another study that was conducted in Atlanta, Georgia on adults between the ages of 18 and 65. 87.8% of the participants identified, most of the participants identified as African American, and 87.8% of the people in the study had experienced at least one trauma. There was another study, a really large data set of 5,653 people. They found that 41.1% of the adults in the study had experienced at least one trauma, and the majority of the study participants identified as Caucasian. Christine Courtois, who's a leading trauma expert, actually says that 80% of people living in the United States have experienced a trauma. And these are really important statistics to keep in mind because, and we'll get into this a little bit when I talk about some of the important things to remember as it relates to trauma-informed care. But sometimes we think about trauma in terms of like a specific group of people who are receiving clinical services. We might have a particular person or race or gender in mind when we're thinking about exposure to trauma. However, these statistics are really important to keep in mind, to remember that most of us have experienced trauma. And when we're talking about the need for trauma-informed care, we're talking about the need for trauma-informed care for most of the people that we're interfacing with, for our coworkers, for the clients that we're serving, for the systems that we're working in. Here are some ways that trauma changes people. And there are many different ways that trauma has an impact on people, but here are a few examples. You feel broken, you don't know who you are anymore. Your thoughts, your feelings, and your memories are all over the place. You're not living up to your potential. You have trouble in relationships, and you think and act differently. There are a wide range of different symptoms that individuals, that communities, and systems can experience as a result of trauma exposure. And what I like to emphasize is that trauma symptoms wear a lot of different masks. So the way that trauma manifests itself in different people's life can really look different depending on the individual, depending on the community, depending on the system. So SAMHSA proposes these particular principles of trauma-informed care. I think it's also important to emphasize there are many other lists that highlight essential aspects of trauma-informed care. So SAMHSA has a list, but then same as when you're looking at different definitions of trauma, depending on the source, there will be many different ways that people articulate how to define trauma. In the same way, there are multiple lists that speak to what are the essential principles of trauma-informed care. However, the principles that are presented by SAMHSA are very frequently used, and there has been a lot of consensus surrounding people who are providing trauma treatment feeling that this is a really solid list of principles. And these principles include safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and an understanding of culture, history, and gender. So I'm sure that you have all heard of trauma-informed care at this point. So trauma-informed care has become a buzzword. Service providers are talking about it, funders are learning more about it, researchers are studying it, theorists are writing about it, academics are teaching it, and it's really important for us to have an understanding of trauma-informed care. So I'm going to talk to you about these few things relating to the truth about trauma-informed care. And this is, so just to give you a brief background about myself, I'm also a trauma survivor. I've experienced complex trauma. I'm a trauma theorist, developing things and developing interventions. And I also am a direct practitioner working directly with traumatized individuals, communities, and systems. So as I was reflecting on this phenomenon of trauma-informed care, I really wanted to think through what are some things that may be missing or we don't talk directly about as it relates to trauma-informed care, and how can I highlight those things to provide support to other people who are trying to implement these principles. So I'm going to talk about each of these things. The first is there's no formula for trauma-informed care. The second is trauma-informed care requires that we renounce an us versus them approach and acknowledge that we're all in this together. Also, going to one trauma training does not make an individual or an organization trauma-informed. Trauma-informed care is just as much about the staff as it is about the clients. Being trauma informed does not necessarily mean that you have to directly talk to trauma survivors about the things that they've been through. And then finally, being trauma informed does not mean that we have to be perfect. So I'm going to go through each of these, and then I'm also going to include some reflective questions that you can ask yourself. I've also asked these questions of myself in the varying roles that I've served in the trauma field. So we're going to go through each of these individually now. So the first idea, there's no formula for trauma-informed care. So many individuals, many organizations are looking for a prescribed list of steps, something that they can follow step by step to say, okay, you know, I can check this off of the list. I can check this off. Okay, I finished the checklist. That must mean that I'm trauma-informed. So in reality, there are these principles that we can use to understand what it means to be trauma informed, but there's no formula for trauma informed care. And part of the reason for that is because trauma informed care looks different depending on the system that you're working in. So trauma informed care would look completely different if you're working in a correctional facility versus an outpatient therapy center versus a school versus a home. So you really have to think about what is the mission, the vision, the purpose of the organization in which you're working, and then how do you take these principles and you apply them to that particular system in a unique way. The problem is that if there was a formula for trauma-informed care, it might not necessarily be the appropriate way to apply those principles depending on the mission, the vision of that particular organization. But instead, we have these principles that can be applied in unique ways depending on what the needs of the client population are, depending on what the purpose of that particular system is. So some reflective questions to think about as you are considering this concept that there's no formula for trauma-informed care are the following. So what is the mission and vision of your organization? I've been engaging in trauma-focused system work, and this is a really important starting place. What is the purpose of the organization? What is the mission? And the mission, the vision, the purpose of the organization, the goals can really drive what trauma-informed practice looks like for that particular setting so that you can come up with a customized process in order to provide trauma-informed support in a way that makes sense given the mission and the vision of that system. You also want to think about what traumas have clients and staff experienced. As I just mentioned, trauma is really pervasive, and I just showed examples of 3 studies. There are many more where those came from, but clients are experiencing trauma, staff are experiencing trauma. Understanding the types of trauma that they have experienced can also kind of impact your customized plan. Also think about what strengths do clients and staff have, and how can you leverage those in implementing trauma-informed care. Also, how can you honor the thoughts and feelings of clients and staff as you co-create a trauma-informed environment, making sure that they're a part of this collaborative process? And then also, how can trauma-informed principles be uniquely applied to your work setting? Once again, there's no formulaic way to apply these principles. You're taking these larger ideas and you're figuring out a way to implement them uniquely in a customized way that makes sense for your particular setting and your system. Another thing to remember is trauma-informed care requires that we renounce an us versus them approach, and we acknowledge that we're all in this together. So I don't know where this comes from, but sometimes providers create this false dichotomy between us versus them. There's the traumatized versus the untraumatized. In reality, though, we're all in this together. The majority of individuals, and if we're thinking about Christine Courtois' statistic, which states that 80% of people living in the United States have experienced trauma, that means that all of us are in this together. Providers, clients, families, administrators, all these different people who are part of the systems in which we're working have also been exposed to trauma. So it's really important for us to remember this. Changing our attitude from a us versus them to an attitude of we're all in this together really makes a difference in our service interactions. It really makes a difference in our collective approach to tackling the impact of trauma. It's important to remember trauma is not a respecter of persons. It doesn't care about a person's age, gender, culture, education, socioeconomic status. We're all in this together because trauma levels the playing field. So here are some important reflective questions that you should consider in order to develop a more collaborative approach and also acknowledge the fact that trauma is impacting all of us. Oops, sorry. So what steps would you need to take in order to move from an us versus them mentality to a we're all in this together approach? Also, to what extent are you collaborating with the trauma survivors that you're working with? Also, how are power dynamics impacting your ability to provide trauma-informed care? Next, going to one trauma training does not make an individual or an organization trauma-informed. This one may seem obvious, however, sometimes it's not. And the purpose of this point is to emphasize the fact that an understanding of trauma and implementation of trauma-informed practices takes time. So going to one training is a start. It's a great start to be able to begin to build your knowledge and your expertise and your understanding of what trauma is, how trauma impacts people, and also to identify trauma healing strategies. But it's important for us to remain humble and realize that there is so much to learn. There's so much for us to learn from trainings, from webinars, from resources, from books, from articles, from journals, and also from people who have actually experienced trauma. So this is an ongoing learning opportunity. It's important for us to also humble ourselves, no matter how many certificates we've earned, what our degrees are, to be able to humble ourselves and to listen to the trauma survivors that we're interacting with, because they are the experts of their own story. They are the experts of their own experiences. And it's important for us to recognize, no matter where we are in our
It's
career.
Suzanne. I just emailed you, and Naja was copied on that, but I just wanted to talk to you about the politics and the internal stuff that we have to push through to get this approved. So anyway, I'm busy.
All right. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Caitlin, you have a second somebody that's logged in, so I'm going to boot them out.
Okay, thank you, Erin.
Sorry about that. Forgot what I was saying. Going to one trauma training does not make an individual or organization trauma informed. Yeah, so it's important for us to humble ourselves and to realize that despite all the knowledge, all of the education that we may have, there is still a ton of different things for us to learn. Always be open to new opportunities to grow, to learn, to develop skills, to look at things in a different way, and also to allow people to be the experts of their own experiences. And then here are some reflective questions to also consider. So how does the theoretical information you learned apply to the clients you work with? So some people have an incredible knowledge and understanding skill set as it relates to really complex theoretical concepts connected to trauma, but it's also important for us to figure out how to translate those ideas into actual direct work with the clients that we're providing support to. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the theory and the practice. So it's essential for us to say, how can I apply this information with actual people? Other questions, how can you use the knowledge you have in your actual work with clients? Are there any gaps in your ability to apply theoretical information to your daily interactions with clients? And what do you need to learn more about? Another thing to think about, trauma-informed care is just as much about the staff as it is about the clients. So there are some organizations, some systems that claim to be trauma-informed, and they do an excellent job of providing trauma-informed support to clients. But when it comes to the treatment of the staff, they're not necessarily as skilled or prepared to provide support to staff members. Trauma-informed care is absolutely just as much about the staff as it is about the clients. As we just mentioned, trauma is also impacting staff. Trauma is no respecter of persons. Just because you're a staff member, you're an administrator, you're a CEO, does not mean that you are exempt or excluded from the impact of trauma. So it's really important for us to identify ways to create a healthy work environment for staff as they're working, because if we are in the midst of a toxic work culture and we're also expected to provide support to other people, but nobody is acknowledging the toxicity in which we have to work, that can create a disconnect between these trauma-informed principles and what we're trying to accomplish with our clients, and then what we're actually doing for ourselves. Here are some reflective questions. How does trauma affect the staff members at your organization? How have you been impacted by the traumas that you've been exposed to in the workplace? What can you and your coworkers do to create trauma-informed conditions for staff? And what self-care strategies can you implement as you navigate stressful work conditions? Another thing to think about, being trauma-informed does not necessarily mean that you have to directly talk to clients about the traumas that they've been through. So some people, when they hear trauma-informed, they think that it means that you absolutely have to talk to people who've been through trauma about the trauma that they have experienced. And that is not the case. So some people are not ready to talk about their trauma. Some people will eventually be ready to talk about their trauma, but some people will never be ready to talk about their trauma. So trauma-informed care does not mean that we need to hear all of the details of our clients' trauma narratives, of the specific traumas that systems have experienced, but it means that we are developing a safe environment, a holding environment for people to feel free to express themselves, to learn, to grow. That might mean that we're helping them delve into some of the traumatic experiences that they've had specifically, but oftentimes people are not necessarily ready to talk about them, but it's about us setting the stage to have a safe, stable environment where people feel like they can thrive and people feel that they can grow. So some reflective questions relating to this: how do your clients process their pain? How can you support your clients without pressuring them to tell their trauma story? Sometimes you think if the person is not talking about their trauma story, like we're not doing enough, and that's not necessarily the case. Also, what strategies can you use with clients who are not willing or able to tell their story? And then finally, being trauma-informed does not mean that we have to be perfect. So I don't know where we got this idea collectively that in order to provide support to trauma survivors, that means that we have to be perfect. That is absolutely not accurate. That's not the case. It's not realistic. We're all human beings. We all have strengths. We all have challenges. We all have barriers. And it's important for us to demonstrate the same compassion for ourselves that we're demonstrating to the trauma survivors that we're working with. So some of us are telling ourselves some very abrasive, negative, demeaning messages that we would never tell to the people that we're providing support to. It's important for us to also recognize, even in the midst of our mistakes, we can still use our mistakes as learning opportunities. Even if we are not perfect, that does not necessarily mean that we still cannot identify ways to recover. The same way that we teach people who've been through trauma that they have opportunities for growth, for recovery, for healing, we should also be conveying those messages to ourselves, realizing that we're doing the best that we can. And if we're not, engaging in self-reflection to identify ways to move forward in a way that is meaningful, and in a way that we can all develop and grow. So there's a theorist named Winnicott, and Winnicott talked about the concept of the good enough caregiver. And Winnicott said that a caregiver does not need to be perfect in order for a child to develop and grow, but they have to be good enough. And I like to apply this idea of the good enough caregiver to the good enough helper. So oftentimes we have this idea in our minds of how we're supposed to achieve perfection, when in reality, it's important for us to be good enough. And that even if we're not perfect, we can really still provide meaningful trauma-informed support to the people that we are assisting. And then reflective questions for this are: what messages do you tell yourself when you don't perfectly implement principles of trauma-informed care? And how can you give yourself the same opportunities for repair that you give to your clients? What realistic expectations can you set for yourself in your journey to becoming trauma-informed? So that ends my presentation, and I believe that Caitlin will facilitate a couple of questions. And then this is my contact information.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. That I really lays out, I think, very well what trauma-informed care is and isn't, and what some really key things that people need to think about when they're looking to implement trauma-informed care individually at their organization, in their community, or to systems level. So thank you. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw it in the chat or in the Q&A. I saw some awesome resources being shared in the chat as well. So I know we have tons of folks on the webinar here who are, well-versed in trauma-informed practice and have been doing a lot of work. So opening it up for questions if anybody has anything. All right, well, I do just want to note that that beautiful background that Megan has, she created herself. So she really does bring creativity to her practice. And we thank you so much for everything that you do in this space and for presenting today. And I think it probably gives people a lot to chew on. Oh, and then I see a question. So says, if appropriate, I would love to share an aha moment we had with staff about how to react to trauma symptoms that we don't understand in a trauma-informed way that was meaningful for staff and interacting with one another. So Theodore, I'm guessing that means that you would like to take a quick moment to share. See if I can.
So Teo, I'll have to allow you to talk here, which I've never done. So this will be interesting. Let me try that real quick. So Teo, I'm going to allow you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Good. I wasn't. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to share. I've worked in settings with developmentally disabled individuals and folks with pretty significant mental health challenges for about 20 years, both in Germany and in the US. And what was sort of a really meaningful aha moment around trauma-informed care was to frame how we react to situations where we observe symptoms of trauma. I'm pretty sure that all of us have been at some outing, at maybe a family reunion, at some Christmas party, where you observed somebody in pretty outrageous behavior, where we all look at each other and somebody might be mouthing something like, what the expletive is wrong with that person. Shifting that reaction that we often have from what is wrong with you or what is wrong with him or her to what happened to that person that they're reacting this way. What happened to that individual that in their mind, this reaction right now is both appropriate or maybe necessary or meaningful to deal with the stress, the whatever triggers that they're experiencing, was really meaningful in dealing with one another amongst the staff, not just the individuals who were taken care of. So to really say when you see something you don't understand, rather than what's wrong with you, to think to yourself, what's wrong with that person? Because it really also offers what's wrong with you as a non-starter. There is no conversation that's fruitful to be had from that reaction. There is potential in saying, what happened to you? I want to understand, for engagement, for building of trust, for interaction. And we don't have to necessarily understand that other person's trauma in order to have that reaction. So I just wanted to offer that because it was really important and meaningful in the interactions I've had.
Absolutely. And Joe Foderero, one of the co-creators of the Sanctuary model, he's credited as being the first person to kind of coin those questions and really encourage us to change. It's like a paradigm shift in how we view our interactions with people who've been through trauma.
Yeah, Thank you so much. So I do see a couple of other questions. Lucy Hockersmith put in the chat, are you aware of any self-assessments for trauma similar to the ACEs questionnaire?
Self-assessments. Whew. Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any. I'm working on a juvenile justice project right now, and I have 1 million juvenile justice related assessments in my brain right now. But I can look and see what else I have, because there probably are. There probably are.
Great. And perhaps we can get, if you find anything, we can get that from you and we can send it out to the group.
Sure.
Another, Rebecca Glazer says, do you have any tips for sharing trauma-informed practices across many facilities?
Yeah, so that could almost be a whole webinar too. But just a couple of things, quick things. Making sure that there's buy-in, building relationships with the organizations and the systems. Things tend to not go over so well if an organization or an outside entity comes in and says, listen, this is what we're going to do. But if you take the approach of collaboratively connecting with people, building relationships, meeting them where they are, and then introducing the strategies, I find that goes over a lot better. If you think of it like, if you're working with an individual clinically, you wouldn't go in and say, I see what your problem is, you're doing it all wrong, and you need to fix it. We wouldn't do that with an individual, but sometimes we inadvertently do that with systems. So I think it's important for us to, the same thing we would do with an individual, meet them where they are, allow them to, define their history, where they've been, where they want to go, and then join with them and introduce ideas and concepts. I have gotten a lot further in my systems work taking that approach.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to try, I have 2 more questions in the Q&A, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to try to combine them a little bit. So should we expect our organization to have trauma-informed care practices? And, while we have another question from Allison Nyhart asking about what this looks like in the context of extension programs that are delivering outreach or education that are not necessarily related to trauma. And do practitioners need to know what happened to someone in order to act in ways that are trauma informed? So one, like, should you expect organizations to be trauma informed? And really sort of, what do we need to know in order to deliver trauma-informed care as practitioners and educators and people who do outreach in communities?
So I'll answer. Okay, can you remind me the first one? I start thinking of my answer.
Should we expect organizations to be trauma-informed?
I would love it if we got to the point societally where we could expect organizations to be trauma-informed. I don't think that we're there yet, but I think we can expect that most people in our organizations are traumatized. Because they are. And I think that if we start thinking about trauma exposure as something that's happening to most of us, then that will create this urgency to say, oh, most of us have experienced trauma. So that means that most of us should be adopting a trauma-informed approach. And if you look at those principles, SANSA's principles specifically, there are things that are like really healthy things for people to do, even if you haven't been through complex chronic trauma as well. They're things that create a healthy workplace. They help to build really healthy relationships. I mean, even if you haven't been through trauma, things like safety, collaboration, choice, they make us feel better as employees, as staff, and they also make clients feel valued. And then for people who are not providing direct care, So as I was mentioning, the way that trauma-informed practices are applied looks different across systems. So how it looks for like an after-school program will look different than how it looks for a foundation. But basically the idea is taking these core principles and figuring out where you can apply them creatively in the specific work that you do. Whether that's work between you and other systems, maybe you're interacting a lot with other systems, with other providers. How can you implement safety, collaboration, empowerment, voice and choice, understanding of culture in those interactions? Or if you're providing training to other staff or you're an administrator, how can you apply these principles in that context? So these are principles that can be kind of applied across all the different levels organizationally, and even with people who are not direct care providers. It just involves like reflecting and figuring out creative ways to apply these principles depending on what particular goals you're working toward.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. We do have a couple other questions, but I really want to make sure we have time for a presentation from Marsha Morgan. So I'm going to move us on to Marsha.
Thank you.
And just to quickly introduce, she started her company, Resilience Builders, after retiring from her position as Chief Operating Officer for Behavioral Health at Truman Medical Center in Kansas City, Missouri. During her time at Truman Medical Center, she led the organization to be one of the Missouri Department of Mental Health's early adopters of trauma-informed care and was a participant in the National Council Community Behavioral Health's first trauma-informed learning collaborative. She is also the co-founder of Trauma Matters KC, where she worked with multiple stakeholders across sectors to establish Kansas City as a trauma-informed, resilient community. In 2015, she took her experience to advise SAMHSA in creating trauma-informed communities, and she is also on the board of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice alongside Megan. So Marsha, I will throw it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Caitlin. Can you see my screen? Hopefully?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we'll tie in and hopefully support everything that, that Megan's just covered, if I can figure out how to make this the next slide. So just one of the things that happened as we were doing this work here in Missouri is that we recognized sort of two things. One is that people were saying that they were trauma informed, and when we actually visited or listened to how they talked about either their staff or their clients, we wondered really whether they were. And then the other thing that started to happen is we would go and say, would you like to become trauma informed? And people would be like, yeah, sure, maybe next year. Or, you know, we have a crisis right now and we really don't know. And what it really came down to, we thought was people didn't really know where to start. And so in Missouri, we did a couple things that were foundational. One is we adopted and with some modification, the SAMHSA principles. So our foundation really includes safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And we rolled the understanding of culture, history, and gender into each of those 5 principles. And as Megan talked about, really find that when you live the principles and you go through this process of gaining understanding, that you really do move in the positive direction. So what I want to share with you is really thinking about what, at an organizational level, what does awareness, sensitivity, responsiveness, and becoming informed really mean? And so as we look at organizations and we look at awareness, it's really it's very simple, understanding what trauma is and being able to have some kind of definition at that awareness level of trauma. And to Theodore's point, beginning to change the question from what's wrong with you, what's wrong with them, to what has happened to them, what's happening to us, looking at prevalence rates, then really starting to just be aware of what is the impact on the individual and what's the impact on the organization when crises happen or when traumas happen. I can tell you from my experience, if we do not tend to what happens in an organization that is a traumatic event, whether it's layoffs or deaths of some of our staff people, deaths of our clients, then that trauma just continues to surface. And you see that when people start talking about 10 years ago, we had a layoff, and it's like hardly anybody in the organization is left, but that culture has absorbed that trauma, and people then walk around in fear. And again, using the principles, understanding what those principles mean. So as we think about safety, it's physical safety and it's emotional safety. When we think about trustworthiness, recognizing the power differential that exists in building relationships. So don't have time to go into all of the nuances within the principles, but know that becoming principle based is moving towards being trauma informed. So as we think about then an organization at the sensitive level, really starting to think about what is happening in our organization, and then really beginning to think also about what if we adopt these principles, if we really move from hanging the principles on the wall to actually doing something, what is that going to mean for our organization? At this level, we're not necessarily talking about making huge changes. We're just really talking about understanding the impact. The other thing that is really, really important, I think, at this stage is really thinking about what does this mean for our leadership as we adopt these principles. And I can tell you, I've been in organizations where the leader will say, yeah, we should become trauma informed. And yes, I buy into it. And then he leads with mandates, or he or she, could be a she, will create the us versus them environment that Megan talked about, that we need to be really very careful about. The other thing that starts happening at the sensitive level is really beginning to figure out who are your champions, and commissioning a committee to lead the work and to start laying some foundation, laying some groundwork for the organization. And then at this level, because we want to help encourage staff to become aware, really being able to start developing and then implementing a trauma-informed training for all staff, and beginning to introduce these concepts for folks to know that we're moving forward with it, with perhaps a change in practice. Then at the responsive level in an organization, what we're really looking at is really activating these principles in our policies and our practices. So we're starting to really look at our human resource policies, our customer service policies. We're also, as we expect policy and procedures to be reviewed, to have somebody in that review process who has that eye on safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And then this is, as we start making these changes, we start really looking at, okay, how can we measure the impact of what it is that we're doing? So, for example, in schools that have started to implement trauma-informed practices, they'll measure truancy, they'll measure graduation rates, they'll measure visits to the principal's office, and then really, again, setting practices in place so that there's continuous improvement for the organization. I can tell you just a couple quick examples. One of the things that we see a lot as people begin at this responsive level is changes in how they discharge clients and changes in how they use consequences or punishment. One of the hurdles that we frequently have to overcome at this level is really helping people understand that trauma-informed practices are not an excuse for behavior, and that people will still experience consequences, but we start really working with the difference between consequences and punishment. So at the trauma-informed level and organizationally talking about reflection and evaluation, we're also talking about beginning to take leadership in larger ways. So advocating for policy changes, training and offering trainings for our communities so that they start understanding why we're doing what it is that we're doing. And then looking at trauma-informed practices for communities, just some subtle but important differences, again, starting with community awareness and really helping people, large communities, understand what they're experiencing. And also, we have found that it's really, really helpful at this awareness stage to, and I do this really throughout, but to really help people understand about resilience and about the opportunities that we have and where our strengths are. So there's always this piece about what is happening to us, and then what strengths do we bring to this experience that help us be able to move forward and to learn from those experiences and to grow. So the other thing that we've really tried to do at this very beginning awareness piece is to recruit community champions. If you're familiar with the collective impact model, there's a lot of reliance on that model to really reach into the community and get some folks involved. And then at this awareness stage, really looking for local needs and what is it, where is it that we may be needed. Then at the trauma sensitive level, we're really talking about forming that community collective and developing the structure, looking for funding. One of the things that's really important in this community work from a funding perspective is to recognize this is not ever going to make a lot of money, right? I mean, you may save money, but you're not going to make a lot of money. And the other piece in terms of looking for funding is making sure that funders understand this is not a one-year kind of a deal and you're going to see lots and lots of results. We need, when we're doing this community work, we need multi-year funding, and we need people to recognize that it's going to last. We need support probably for a minimum of 3 years and more likely for 10 years. And that's not usually how funders think about grants and our grant awards. So again, thinking about as we look in this community, okay, what kinds of approaches can we develop to reach everyone? And then where is the most need? And is there a possibility that we can create a targeted community response? And then at the responsive level, we really hold regular meetings. We host events for the community to continuously learn and grow. And we hopefully, again, with funding, are measuring the impact for our communities. And then at some level, then we can begin to really publish and promote what is going on so that we can replicate these positive practices. We can support the organizations that are in the community. And then really at this trauma-informed level, I can't emphasize it enough that we really become advocates for the work and advocates for these principles that are so important to permeate throughout everything that we do. So these are some of the resources that we rely on, we use a lot. If, as Megan suggested, there are some specific resources. If you're in healthcare, there's a handbook for sensitive practices for healthcare practitioners that Canada actually put together. That is a wonderful resource. If you're doing work with schools, there are a number of really, really wonderful resources for schools also. So this is just kind of a high level group. One of the other resources that I use to help many, many organizations develop awareness is from the Anna Institute, the document In Their Own Words, which again brings trauma survivor voices to this experience as we learn and grow. So that's it for me. Caitlin, unless anybody has any questions.
All right, folks. So, Marcia, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I think it coupled really nice with Megan's and sort of thinking about how what this really looks like as people are implementing at different sort of socio-ecological levels. So thank you so much. And I learned a lot through that. So thank you. Sure. We'll open it up. We have a couple of minutes left and just wanted to open it up for any questions directly for Marcia in the chat or in the Q&A. And Marcia, one question I had is if you could share that last resort from the Anna Institute.
Sure.
So to share it out with everyone, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, it's there are comment, the voice of the trauma survivors is so compelling in that document. It's an older document, but it is absolutely wonderful for folks to, I think, really get an understanding of how impactful their experience is, and what hurts as well as what helps. So
okay, so it looks like we have a question. Has anyone come across a convincing argument that leaders who do not see the value in trauma-informed practices? Marcia, I'll throw that to you.
Sure. I think that again, some of it depends on the setting, but we're starting to see enough documentation, enough publications that regardless of the setting, you can point to some schools that really are successful in implementing this. For example, do have reduced suspensions, do have increased graduation rates, do have increased academic achievements. We also in one of our prisons, for example, where they implemented trauma-informed practices, they saw and this was with the folks the inmates who were there for life because of murder. They saw a decrease in injuries to their staff. They were able to move their inmates from mostly being in solitary confinement to being in groups. They were able to move some of their prisoners from this confined space into general population. So, it's just more a matter of depending on who the leader is and what setting they're in to find those pieces. We see general improvement in staff satisfaction and then, general improvement in client satisfaction and client experiences.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you see it sort of across the board. You're able to better serve clients and better meet the needs of your staff. I
was just going to say the one really critical piece in this is leadership buy-in. And what we also see is if the leader isn't buying in, and if the leader isn't willing to do their own self-reflection and look at their own pieces, and or set up a structure where they're involved, then it's really, really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna actually close this out. Just because we are at the 4 o'clock. So thank you all so much for joining us. This has been a really illuminating experience, and thank you so much to Marcia and Megan for presenting. I am gonna throw in the chat a post-test. So for the folks who are still on, if you could take our very brief post-test, and we would just love to have some feedback as we're planning our next webinar. And then to save the date for our first learning circle. So, as a part of this webinar series, we'll be doing some learning circles with some discussion, breakout groups, so that folks can have some time to really kind of connect with each other. We've seen so much great interaction in the chat and the Q&A that we just can't get to in an hour-long webinar. So really trying to provide some time for some discussion among folks, and especially because we know we have so many experts in the audience as well as our presenters. So that will be on Wednesday, May 13th at 3 o'clock Eastern, and more information to come on that from Erin. And once again, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, Bev, or Erin, all of our contact info here. And we'll be sending all of this information, the slides, and the recording out to everybody, and posting on Connect Extension and on the Scattergood Foundation website. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you to our presenters, and thank you, Dr. Coperly, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our learning circle here in just a couple of weeks. Thank you all.
Thank you.